Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's conversation on race and policing. My name is Matt Patino. Welcome to all of you. Today, we are happy to have a conversation with an award-winning journalist, Cerise Castle. But before we begin, I will read our land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuhaviatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And now I will hand it over to Professor Emeritus Mary Texeira.
Thank you, Matt. I am so happy to introduce our guest today. I first caught wind of Cerise a few months, maybe a year and a half ago on Sirius XM, my local service service provider, cable service provider. And she was talking about doing an investigation of deputy gangs in the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. So I sort of tucked that away in the back of my mind and then kept reading about her in the paper. She was being cited in articles, and so I thought, yeah, we should probably bring her to Cal State, because I think her research fits right in with what we're doing in this space every week, and what we have been doing for the last 3 years. So I will just read a little something about her bio and then hand it over to Cerise, and just want to welcome her. She's a Los Angeles-based journalist specializing in arts and culture, civil rights, crime, and human interest stories. She's had several years of experience as a multimedia journalist across print, television, and audio. She wrote the first history of deputy gangs inside the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. She's produced and hosted segments for the Emmy Award-winning nightly news program Vice News Tonight, NPR, and nationally syndicated radio program Marketplace. She's also produced podcast series for Audible, iHeartMedia, and Wondery. Her reporting and commentary have been featured in publications like The Daily Beast, The Los Angeles Times, Los Angeles Magazine, and MTV. In 2022, she was a recipient of the International Women in Media Foundation's Courage Award. And I just found out yesterday and just spoke with her about it, and she's given me permission to let you know that she was just signed with one of California's largest talent agencies, CAA. So, we're going to expect even bigger and better things from Cerise, and we're very, very fortunate to have her on this panel or in this space today. So without any further ado, I give you Cerise Castle. Welcome, Cerise.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be sharing this information with you all. Thank you, everyone who is here in attendance. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a PowerPoint that I am going to be presenting today and talking a little bit to you with the assistance of these slides. But before I begin, I would love to give a little bit of background about myself, my work in the journalism industry, and how I ended up here today investigating deputy gangs. I was first inspired to become a journalist after a sort of chance encounter with Ann Curry, who is a very accomplished journalist, when I was in the 8th grade during a field trip my middle school took to New York City. We visited Rockefeller Center, and came out and was speaking to us kids who had gathered out in the open air way to try to get a chance on TV. And while she was speaking to us, she asked me what I wanted to do once I became an adult. And I told her that I wasn't sure. She asked me what my favorite subjects were in school, and I told her I really enjoyed English and history. And she said that I might want to consider becoming a journalist. So I came back home to California and I started working with the school newspaper. And that really began my journey in journalism. I continued to freelance as a written print reporter in college. And I also did some work for our college radio station as well as our college television station. I went to Emerson. I hosted the only hip hop program in Boston for 2 years, which was one of the top rated programs in the Boston metro area. I was a correspondent for our local television show at Emerson that was geared specifically towards political reporting. And once I graduated, I continued to work in the reporting space. One of my professors, Martha Little, helped me get an internship at a show that is produced by a company called American Public Media and airs on NPR stations called Marketplace. It's a syndicated finance program that is really popular with NPR listeners. So I started out as an intern there, and I was able to parlay that internship into my first full-time job, where I was a producer for the program and started getting on the radio again as a reporter and correspondent. After about 2 years at Marketplace, I was recruited by Vice News to come and do a screen test for their new television program that they were launching on HBO. And after completing that screen test, I was asked to come on board and be a on-air correspondent and producer, which I did for 2 years. Had a lot of fun pursuing stories that maybe were a little bit unorthodox or overlooked by legacy media companies. One of my favorite stories that I worked on was with the singer Brent Faiyaz about how he had managed to become a Grammy-nominated artist without any backing of a major record company. He did it all independent. I investigated the trafficking of fentanyl into the United States from China. Was part of the first new Western news team to interview the Chinese government about this issue. And I
Cerise,
also,
if I can, I hate to do this. Our tech is asking if you can check your screen share. Are you in screen share mode? And is your PowerPoint coming up? Because we don't see it.
Oh no. Yeah, I just have one slide open. You haven't missed anything. So let me stop the share.
Okay.
And I will try again.
Thank you for calling that to our attention, Finn.
Can
Still
you see?
seeing the same thing.
No. How interesting. What should I do?
If you want to send your PowerPoint slide to me,
Sure.
via email, or you can, just send it to me via email and I'll see if I can share it.
Okay, just a second.
I'm not sure what's going on. What do you think, Finn?
I think she may have a single screen issue, maybe. But,
What kind of issue?
sometimes when you share the screen, you just have to share your first screen. And,
Okay.
if you can forward me that PowerPoint, I can go ahead and share it on my.
Put it in the chat.
No, you can go ahead and email it to Mary, and Mary can forward it to me.
Right. Excuse me. I just sent that to
Okay.
you both.
Okay.
Um,
I think you're in on that email, Finn.
Wait, I'll check it right now.
Okay, because I don't see it yet, but I'll refresh my screen. Not yet. not yet. So carry on. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. And you didn't miss anything. It was just the introductory slide while I was just
Okay.
talking about myself.
You may have to wing it just in case. We always have to have a plan B and C and D. So
Very true.
No problem. This is not the first time. So go ahead.
All right. So I think I was talking about my work at Vice.
Right.
So I did a number of stories that were really great. I was talking about, I was part of the first team of Western journalists to speak to the Chinese government about the issue of fentanyl trafficking into the United States. I also produced a documentary about a stripper strike that was going on in the New York metropolitan area, which we were the first news team to cover labor issues in the sex industry seriously, which was really important to be a part of.
Right.
Unfortunately, the show was canceled after a few years, despite the fact that we were incredibly successful and won several Emmys. That's just sort of the nature of the television business. So at that point, I went back to freelance writing, reporting on local issues here in Los Angeles County, and applying for full-time work. I landed a job at KCRW, which is a local NPR affiliate here in Los Angeles in 2019. And I worked as a producer for All Things Considered at KCRW for about 2 years. I was part of the union drive and helped establish the first union at the station. And was incredibly vocal about issues of racism, homophobia, and transphobia that were pervasive at the station, which is a fantastic way to completely alienate your bosses and get on their bad side. But I regret nothing, and I'm really happy that I was part of that organization effort and ensuring fair wages for future workers. Ultimately, though, once our contract was approved, everyone was offered a voluntary buyout. As a union steward, I said then, and I think now, that was a ploy to get out of paying people the wages that we had fought so hard for. And it was communicated to me at that point that positions that were considered redundant would be fired without any care package should they not take the buyout. And I was told that I was a redundancy. So at that point, I chose to leave. I wrote a letter to all of my colleagues about why I had made that choice and the issues that I still wanted to see addressed at the station, which ended up in the Los Angeles Times and received quite a bit of attention. And I'm glad that that attention was given to the issue. It's a major issue in the journalism industry. Just the disparities and prejudices that impact not only how people relate to each other in the newsroom, but the stories that get covered. And that dovetails really nicely into my work in the deputy gangs space. While I was nearing my end at KCRW, I began looking into the issue of deputy gangs. And that really arose from a incident that happened in May of 2020 following the murder of George Floyd. I should also say, I should have said this at the top, but the issue of deputy gangs has fascinated me since childhood. I had heard about deputy gangs from family members, some of who are here on the Zoom, kids on the playground, and teachers throughout my life growing up. And I've always been very academically inclined, and I can remember going to the library and searching through newspaper archives and looking for a book about the issue, but there was never anything there. You would get a one-off article, but there was no comprehensive accounting of this issue. And that was something that I kept coming back to at different points throughout my life. I thought really hard about doing a study on deputy gangs for my thesis in college, but for different reasons at different points, it just didn't come together. It didn't work out. So in May of 2020, I was still working for KCRW at that point, and I was in the field covering protests that had erupted in response to the murder of George Floyd, and I was shot by a police officer with a less lethal munition. And, excuse me, the injuries that resulted from that shooting put me on bed rest for about 6 months. And I was not allowed to be in the field. I wasn't allowed to be reporting on doctor's orders. And I did not feel good about those circumstances. I did not feel good about not being able to work and contribute as a Black journalist, as a Black woman in journalism. It just did not feel, I did not feel comfortable with that. So I remember very vividly sitting on my couch and watching the local news, and a friend of mine, Kate Cagle, anchor at Spectrum News 1, had got her hands on some deposition testimony from a deputy who was working at the Compton station. And a few days after I was shot with the less lethal, a teenager by the name of Andres Guardado was shot and killed at his job by sheriff's deputies. And in this deposition that Kate aired on her show, a deputy said under oath in sworn testimony that the deputies who had killed this teenager were prospects in a deputy gang. And when I saw that, I remembered all of these questions that had been plaguing me for the past 20 some odd years. And I thought to myself, well, perhaps this is the time to investigate. I don't have to leave my couch to file public records requests and begin an investigation. So I started doing that. I began watching the meetings of the Board of Supervisors, looking for mentions about deputy gangs, and I found one. I found a report that was requested by the board asking our county council to provide a report on all litigation related to deputy gangs. And I filed a public records request for that report. And a few months later, I got the response and I was given the report. And I used that report as a roadmap to create what has become the 15-part series, A Tradition of Violence, as well as the podcast of the same name, delving into the history of deputy gangs in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. So I'll talk a little bit now about the aims of this presentation that I have for you today. We're going to be discussing how the culture inside of the LASD has allowed gangs to come to be, and it continues to allow them to grow and to multiply. Deputy gangs are just a symptom of a broken system. We're discussing these topics under the lens of deputy gangs, but it's important to remember that these issues exist outside of the deputy gang structure too. And these issues, including deputy gangs, are not unique to the LA County Sheriff's Department. We can go to the next slide. So it's important to define what a deputy gang is and what...
Sorry, Cerise, I need to interrupt one more time, and I promise this is the last time. Would you go back to the previous slide then? And can you identify those people? Because I think your graphics are just absolutely beautiful. If you can identify those three men in that photo or that piece of art and say where they are today.
Of course. So the men that you're looking at in this photo are very prominent figures in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. To the back right is former Sheriff Lee Baca. Next to him on the left is Paul Tanaka, who was his undersheriff, which is second in command of the entire department. And in the foreground, that is former Sheriff Alex Villanueva, who was sheriff when this initial written series was published and throughout most of the production of the podcast. Lee Baca and Paul Tanaka were both found guilty of federal obstruction of justice charges and sentenced to time in federal prison. They've both since been released. I was able to speak to Lee Baca on the phone following his release about my reporting and had a good long conversation with him in which he told me that I was a very dedicated and talented reporter and that he did not regret anything that he did. Paul Tanaka, he's also out now, and I haven't been able to talk to him yet, but he's been spotted in Orange County playing golf. Alex Villanueva, he was defeated in our most recent election in November by a challenger, and he's now living in Hacienda Heights, where he has a home, and I hear, is planning to run for the LA Board of Supervisors. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to talk more about each of them a little bit more in detail during this presentation. So yeah, let's start off by talking about what a deputy gang is and what it's not. Oftentimes we hear both from policing agencies and members of the media, these deputy gangs referred to as cliques, fraternities, subgroups. These are not good words to use for that. Why? Let's take it to the next slide. The California Penal Code is actually really clear about what a gang is. It's section 186.22 for reference. It defines a gang as any organization or group of 3 or more people that, 1, have a common name or identifying symbol. The photo that you're seeing here is the deputy gang tattoo of the Banditos deputy gang, which is based at the East Los Angeles station. Let's go to the next slide. Second, in order to be a gang under California Penal Code, this group has to have as one of its many primary activities the commission of a long list of criminal offenses under the California Penal Code. And finally, next slide. 3, members have engaged in a, quote, pattern of criminal gang activity, either alone or together. And crimes in the case of deputy gangs include murder, rape, kidnapping, money laundering, and falsifying police reports. Let's go to the next slide. Mean Girls, one of my favorite movies, and it is a classic example of what a clique is. This movie tells the story of a group of high school girls who bully each other and other students. Let's go to the next slide. Deputy gangs are not cliques. These are criminal organizations. They encourage illegal activity against community members. They have tattoos and they use hand signs. In the top left corner, you can see the tattoos of 2 deputies who are members of a gang called the Executioners. Below them is a deputy throwing up the hand sign for the Linwood Vikings deputy gang. Above it to the right, you'll see members of the deputy gang, the 3000 Boys, which is based inside of Men's Central Jail, throwing up their gang sign. And below them, you'll see a woman who is holding a pillow with the gang insignias of 3 different deputy gangs that have existed inside of the East Los Angeles station. Let's go to the next slide. So in 2021, after my report was published, the California legislature approved AB 958, which became a section of the California Penal Code that prohibits involvement in police gangs, and it makes departments tell other law enforcement agencies if someone was fired for being in a deputy gang. But there is no criminal charges if an officer is found to be in a deputy gang. And really important to emphasize here, they only need to tell them if they were fired for being in that deputy gang. This legislation was authored by Mike Gibson. He's a California assemblyman. Before he became a politician, Gibson was actually a police officer with the Maywood Police Department. That department was shut down in 2010 after the city lost its insurance policy because the police department was too high of a liability. And there were a number of reasons for that. A big one was an excessive number of complaints against officers in the department. And those complaints included police violence, false arrests, and rogue cops. Again, very similar patterns and practices to what we see under the deputy gang umbrella. The bill was also sponsored by LA County Sheriff Alex Villanueva, who I talked about a little bit at the top. Villanueva was notorious throughout his 4-year reign as sheriff for continually denying the existence and the influence of deputy gangs. So the Los Angeles District Attorney spoke to me about this new legislation earlier this year. They said that, quote, "We take alleged membership in deputy gangs very seriously. As currently written, the law prohibits membership in law enforcement gangs and requires law enforcement to disclose the termination of an officer for participation in a law enforcement gang to a law enforcement agency conducting a pre-employment background investigation on such an officer. However, the law does not make membership alone a criminal offense. If it is determined that a particular law enforcement officer who is a member of law enforcement gang has committed a specific criminal offense beyond membership that can be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, this office will file charges." So essentially, the DA is saying here that being a deputy gang member, 1, is not a crime. 2, they will only file charges if they think they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that deputy gang members have committed crimes, which, takes that out of the hands of the jury, which is something that we should be thinking about. And 3, as I mentioned at the top, this law only requires that these policing agencies are only passing on information about gang members within their ranks if that person is fired. It's important to note that, to my knowledge, only 8 people have been fired for being deputy gang members at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and all 8 of them were able to sue and get their jobs back. Let's go to the next slide. So let's go over some of my key highlights from my reporting on deputy gangs. The first is that there are at least 22 deputy gangs that I know of that have formed and have operated, and some are still operating within the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. 2, deputy gangs were involved in the deaths of at least 23 civilians. That number is pretty low, and I imagine that it's much higher. Those are the deaths that I have been able to tie with significant evidence to deputy gang members. When we're looking at those deaths, all of the people killed were men of color, and at least 4 of them were in the midst of a mental health crisis when they were killed. Let's go to the next slide. So LA County, as I mentioned, keeps a list of litigation related to deputy gangs. I created a database of deputies alleged to be associates and tattooed members of deputy gangs. I was inspired to create this by systems like CalGang, which is widely used by policing agencies in Los Angeles County and across California. And CalGang, for those who don't know, is a database of alleged gang members. If you are found to be a gang member that's in CalGang, if you're arrested, that comes with a number of enhancements. And if you're convicted, you can end up doing significantly more time than someone who isn't in CalGang. And the bar to get into CalGang is very, very low. It classifies gang members based on family members, where someone may live, who they are friends with. Under those circumstances, people that have no reason to be in there have been categorized under that bar. I myself could be put in CalGang, and an audit of CalGang found entries of, I believe, a baby as young as 3 months old being entered into this system as an active gang member. So as you can imagine, there were a lot of issues with that system. Now, the deputy gang database acknowledges deputies and upper level personnel who were present or oversaw illegal activities as associates of deputy gangs. Those who have been identified in court cases through self-admissions and tattoos are categorized as members. Tattoos are given at so-called 998 parties. That name comes from the police code for officer-involved shooting. And it is alleged that in order to get into some of these deputy gangs, a deputy has to kill a civilian. Litigation related to these deputy gangs has cost LA County at least $100 million, and that is paid for by taxpayers. Let's go to the next slide. So government agencies like the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, the Office of Independent Review, the Los Angeles District Attorney, the California State Senate, and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights have known about deputy gangs for decades. Let's go to the next slide. During this time, prior to my series being published, there were no meaningful internal investigations. Next slide. There have been patterns of deputy gang violence against community members as well. Next slide. And that looks like raids, illegal detainments and arrests, physical assaults, planting and manipulating evidence. Next slide. Harassment of victims' family members and members of the press, killings. Next slide. Inside the jails, this looks like beatings, sometimes to the point of death, rape. Next slide. Tasers to the genitalia, OC or pepper spray to the genitalia and eyes. Next. And there have also been patterns of this sort of harassment and violence against other people working within the department. And that looks like mockery on social media, falsifying reports, denying promotions, psychological exams that are forced upon them. We've seen dead animals placed on personal or county property in their possession, threats of murder, people pointing guns, and drive-by shootings on the homes of agency members that are trying to call out this bad behavior. Let's go to the next slide. So this is an example of some of those things that I was talking about. The first thing that you'll see on the top, this Instagram screenshot, this was posted on a Instagram profile that was very sympathetic to deputy gangs. It's a photo of a rat on a motorcycle, and it's captioned, "Wanted to be a bandito," which, as I mentioned, is a deputy gang, but I'll settle for the rat crew king. Basically calling the guy who spoke out against the banditos a snitch. And below that, you'll see a dead rat, and that was placed on the property of another whistleblower on the banditos. Let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to show you how this culture metastasizes throughout the department. So I prepared a brief case study. First, some background. Once deputies graduate the academy for the sheriff's department here in LA, they move on to the jails where they do the next part of their training. And after about 1 to 3 years in the jails, they move on to patrol at a station. Within the jails, there are at least 4 known deputy gangs that are currently in operation. The one that we know the most about is the 3000 Boys, and they operate within the 3000 block of Men's Central Jail. So let's take a look at how people involved with the 3000 Boys take that culture of the gang that they're learning in the jails and bring it out onto the streets, and what happens with that. In 2010, Christopher Lee Wilder's jaw is broken by Deputy Jay Brown inside Men's Central Jail. On December 11th, 2011, Deputy Samuel Aldama beats Alquan Jackson, who was incarcerated inside Men's Central Jail. Both of those deputies are alleged to be 3000 Boys associates. Next slide, please. January 6th, 2015, Brian Pickett is killed by deputies Renee Berrigan, Ryan Rothrock, and others. All are alleged to be Spartans Associates, which is a deputy gang based in the South Los Angeles area. April 10th, 2015, Tayshawn Gaither is shot by Jay Brown and others, and all are alleged to be Spartans Associates. Next slide, please. January 15th, 2016, Samuel Aldama and Mizra Norego beat and falsely imprisoned Sheldon Lockett. Both of these deputies are tattooed executioners, and those are their actual tattoos that you can see in the photo there. Let's go to the next slide. March 16th, 2016, Christian Medina is shot and killed by Renee Berrigan, who killed Brian Pickett, and Jay Brown, who shot Tayshawn Gaither. Both of those deputies are alleged to be Spartan's associates. Let's go to the next slide. August 25th, 2016, Samuel Aldama and Mizra Norego shoot and kill Dante Taylor. August 16th, 2017, Kenneth Lewis is killed by Ryan Rothrock, who also killed Brian Pickett. Next slide, please. On November 2nd, 2017, Ricardo Sendejas Jr. is killed after he is seen by Deputy Samuel Aldama and others holding a gun at his home. And I want to point out here that under California law, holding a gun at your own home is not a crime. Aldama is a tattooed executioner, and all of the others that were involved in that fatal shooting are alleged Spartan's associates. Next. So in total, that's 3 assaults, 1 non-fatal shooting, 5 deaths across 3 different deputy gangs. Jay Brown, 1 assault, 1 non-fatal shooting, and 1 death. Samuel Aldama, 2 assaults, 2 deaths. Renee Berrigan, 2 deaths. Ryan Rothrock, 2 deaths. And Mizra Norego, 1 assault. All of these deputies still appear to be employed by the sheriff's department, and some of them have even been promoted. Let's go to the next slide. So we're talking about this stuff as it relates to deputy gangs, but as I said at the top, it emulates throughout the culture in the sheriff's department, and gangs are just a symptom of that culture. In cities like Compton, we see these same practices mimicked on a wider scale when contracts are given to the sheriff's department by the city for law enforcement services and they go unfulfilled. One way that we see that happening is that patrol cars will be marked as out on patrol on the streets, when in reality, they're parked and they are stationary, but the city is still charged for that patrol. Emily Elena Dugdale at LAist found that sheriff's deputies in the Antelope Valley schools stop and question Black teens up to 4 times as often as their peers. And there have been several incidents where videos of deputies physically assaulting children have gone viral, and yet there is no disciplinary action towards those deputies. Let's go to the next slide. Deputies also use a practice called hunting, which former Deputy Angel Reynosa described to me as searching for someone to arrest in order to get an arrest statistic. He told me that deputies will utilize the traffic code to stop people of color explicitly for minor violations, and deputies will also take advantage of these people who may not be as fluent with their rights under the law and end up with them in custody. Let's go to the next slide. Another example is repeated killings of community members with no discipline. Deputy Gregory Van Housen killed a 16-year-old by the name of AJ Weber on Super Bowl Sunday in February of 2018. That case was settled for over $3 million. And again, I want to mention here that deputies are rarely financially liable for these settlements because of qualified immunity. That bill is picked up by taxpayers like you and I. 18 months after the case related to the death of AJ Weber was settled, Deputy Gregory Van Housen killed someone again. He killed 22-year-old Jamal Simpson. Now, he was never disciplined for either of these shootings, and he is still employed by the sheriff's department. He, last I heard, was working at Men's Central Jail. Let's go to the next slide. The sheriff's department continues to avoid accountability when it comes to this issue. We see this by Sheriff Villanueva asking the county to ban the phrase deputy gangs, refusing to adhere to subpoenas. when it comes to the Civilian Oversight Commission, and refusing to comply with records disclosure laws under California law. Next slide. We've also seen cosmetic fixes like the banning of some deputy gang logos, such as the Fort Apache logo, which you see there, affiliated with the East Los Angeles station. It was actually that photo, a mural of that logo was placed in the floor at the station. It was banned in 2016 by former Sheriff Jim McDonnell, but Sheriff Villanueva chose to bring that logo back in 2018. He did not say why he did that. The logo is really popular with deputies working at East LA, and you can see them wearing pins while out on patrol. And I've seen merchandise with that logo being sold online. Also, things like the firing and hiring of deputies, that is not public information, and deputies can appeal when they are fired, and more often than not, they win their jobs back. And there are currently no tools to effectively combat deputy gangs. Current policies only target new recruits and do not do anything about existing gang members. Let's go to the next slide. Ooh, I don't know if this is going to play. There should be a video there, but if it's not working, no matter. Oh, let's see.
Sound.
Yeah, I'm not hearing it.
Yeah.
It's not really important. I have it linked in other places, but essentially in this clip, he is saying deputy gangs do not exist. And then he goes back to say, well, actually they
Such a
exist.
thing as a deputy gang, understanding the full knowledge of what a gang means, we'd fire him, plain and simple. I've yet to find one. In fact, if someone can find one or a gang member who wears tan and green, please let me know. And they just don't exist. And let me pause it real quick about the issue about deputy cliques. There's cliques everywhere. There's cliques in the newsroom. There's cliques in hospitals, in the military, every single police station.
Right. So he's saying here that there are no deputy gang members, but that these groups exist in every police department. That's just impossible. You can't have it both ways. Let's go to the next slide. The leadership structure within the sheriff's department actively promotes deputy gangs. Classic example is former Sheriff Lee Baca, who I mentioned at the top. He promoted Paul Tanaka, who was a tattooed member of a white supremacist gang called the Vikings. And Lee Baca made Paul Tanaka his undersheriff. You can see Paul Tanaka in that photo on the bottom there with undersheriff pointing to him. And also captioned is former assistant sheriff Cecil Rambo. In that photo, you can see them all throwing up their signs and having some brewskis with the boys. Sheriff Alex Villanueva, who is in the top photo, reinstated Deputy Karen Mandoyan, who was fired for domestic violence, which is an incredibly rare occurrence when you're talking about domestic violence resulting in any sort of punishment for sheriff's deputies. It's quite notable that Mandoyan was actually fired for domestic violence because it just doesn't happen that much. But Sheriff Villanueva went out of his way to bring Mr. Mandoyan back. Mr. Mandoyan is a self-admitted member of the Grim Reapers. He is no longer with the sheriff's department. A judge stepped in there and saw that he was removed. But his attorney tells me that they are willing to continue fighting and appealing that decision for as long as it will take. We have a new sheriff who was just elected, Robert Luna. He has kept Assistant Sheriff Holly Francisco in her position. Holly Francisco, during the Villanueva years, consistently questioned the validity of the Civilian Oversight Commission, said that their investigation into deputy gangs was a farce, and was just openly hostile to the investigatory work that was being done in relation to deputy gangs. So when we see practices like that, it's, kind of hard to believe that this issue is being taken seriously. And another big threat to the pervasiveness of deputy gangs is media coverage. As I mentioned at the top, we've seen legacy media for years and years not using the proper terminology to discuss this issue. I think my reporting has definitely made things a little bit better in that we'll now see the word deputy gang actually printed instead of, sort of nonsense words like subgroup or fraternity. However, we're still seeing scare quotes, which again, we know that these are gangs. They are defined as such under California Penal Code. And it's important to call these things what they are. Let's go to the next slide. So since my reporting was published, we are seeing the term deputy gang more widely used in media and government. We've seen Wikipedia pages created for deputy gangs. We have seen graffiti and hashtags encouraging people to Google LASD gangs throughout Los Angeles County and online. Go to the next slide. So in conclusion, these are deputy gangs. Please call them deputy gangs. Problematic personnel we see are retained and promoted within the sheriff's department, and deputy gangs are a symptom of a larger corrupt culture. And if you would like more information on these issues, I encourage you all to visit lasdgangs.com. And thank you so much. And I'd love to answer some of your questions.
Dan.
Thank you so much for that.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much for that presentation. And the first question I have is someone's already asked it. It says, have you had threats on your life and well-being, and how often?
Yeah, I have had many, threats on my life. Immediately following the publication of the series is when I got the first big wave of threats, death threats, rape threats, that kind of thing. It's kind of gotten, they haven't completely died off. I still get them every now and then when I'm working on something, but they don't scare me as much as they used to. And I really think that they've fallen off so much because my reporting has continued to be lifted up. I think that people felt a lot more comfortable threatening me when I was just a, freelancer that no one had heard of working for a small community news site. No one, would really question if anything happened to me. No one would really care, frankly. But now that my reporting has been featured in other prominent places, that I continue to speak up about it, and that I'm getting recognition from my industry peers, I don't think that people feel as comfortable making those threats, because now when I say something, people listen. If something were to happen to me, a lot of people would be asking questions.
And another question, and this is one I've always had, because most deputies start off in jail. So do you feel deputies starting their careers in the prison is used to teach them see all civilians as criminals once they are on the street?
I definitely think that working in the jail and in that environment contributes to a lot of the violence that we are seeing on the street. And sources that I have in the department have agreed and said that they believe as much as well. The jails are a black hole. It's really difficult for anyone to really know what's happening in the jails. There really isn't any oversight. It's even if you are a member of an oversight commission, you can't just show up in the jail and ask people questions and tour the facilities. You have to schedule, which gives lead time to hide some of those issues. And when deputies are trained in an environment like that, where bad behavior goes unpunished and there's no one really looking out, yes, they do think that this is the way that they need to conduct themselves when they get out into the street. And even more importantly, the violent behavior in the jails is rewarded. They are fast-tracked to go out on patrol when they have multiple incidents of force. They're seen as the type of deputy that is willing to do whatever it takes to effectively police, which, really flies in the face of constitutional policing principles. But unfortunately, that's the kind of behavior that is rewarded and promoted inside the LA County Sheriff's Department.
Go ahead, Mary.
Thank you, Stan. I'm hoping to get points for being polite this week and raising my hand, because usually I just butt in, Cerise. So I'm being good this week. Your report is absolutely fascinating, and I want to congratulate you again for your tenacity and your inquisitiveness and going after some answers. It's really hard to believe, although I do believe you, that this is being allowed to happen. For 30, 40 years now, this is going on. And I wanted to ask you about the role of the federal government, because, federal governments can sometimes take over police departments. LA Sheriff is the largest in the world, I believe, the largest sheriff's department in the world. What role does the federal government have in oversight of all of this?
I think the federal government has an incredible responsibility here. We have seen the federal government intervene in the LA County Sheriff's Department, specifically when it came to former Sheriff Lee Baca and Paul Tanaka. And it was related to violence in the jails committed by the hands of, alleged members of the 3000 Boys and the 2000 Boys gang. That escalated when Lee Baca and Paul Tanaka were found responsible for a scheme to actually subvert the FBI's investigation and stop them from looking into this issue. The FBI had an incarcerated man who was an informant for them. And Baca and Tanaka conspired to hide this man for a number of days, so he was unable to communicate with his FBI handlers and get them the information that they needed. And that is what led to them being federally incarcerated. And as a result of that investigation, there were a number of recommendations and new policies that were introduced to the jails. Unfortunately, now in 2023, a number of those policies are no longer being enforced, and ACLU monitors that are tasked with going into the jail on a regular basis and making sure that the department is adhering to those have said that they're backsliding and we are not seeing the adherence that is needed. One monitor that I spoke to said that she's fearful that the 3000 Boys are back and fully active again inside Men's Central Jail. I've spoken to men that have recently been released from Men's Central Jail who have told me that they are experiencing high amounts of violence at the hands of the deputies. And, my reporting is out there. There's now been an investigation by the Civilian Oversight Commission into this issue. The report that they have authored is due out today. So there's an incredible amount of evidence that this is, a huge issue in, as you said, the largest sheriff's department in the world. I think the federal government has an incredible amount of responsibility here to step in and do something. We've had members of the House, Maxine Waters, Jimmy Gomez, writing letters to the Department of Justice, begging them to come and do something about this. The FBI, I know, said that they were investigating this issue in 2019. It's been 5 years now. I think residents of Los Angeles County and members of the Sheriff's Department are really hungry for something to happen because unfortunately, I think, without a larger agency coming in and really taking stock of the issue, I don't think that this can be effectively addressed.
And speaking of other members, I don't know if you read, I think I read this a couple of weeks ago, and this would have really come under what we call good news in every time we host this webinar. A young deputy from, I think it was East LA station, has sued because he has been actively they're trying to recruit him to join one of the gangs, and I think it's East LA station. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, there have been a number of deputies that have sued the county because they have either been asked to join this gang and retaliated against for saying, no, I will not, or for simply working in the East Los Angeles station and not participating in this illegal activity. They've been targeted. And it's really unfortunate, but that's not the only station that's happening. It's not the only station where a deputy gang is really running things. I've been in contact with a former acting captain who was literally chased out of his station because he did not go along with the deputy gang members' whims. These were all people that ranked below him, but the power structure is so strong that they were able to actually have him removed from that station, even though he outranked them and he was trying to do the right thing.
There's a question here, and I'm not sure what the word is. It says, are all these deputy gangs like COINTELPRO?
Are all these deputy gangs like COINTELPRO? And COINTELPRO, that was a program by the FBI in the 1960s that spied on residents of the community who were organizing, and for the most part, I think were adherents to leftist political ideology, groups like the Black Panthers. I was at UCLA yesterday. COINTELPRO instigated the murders of 2 members of the Black Panther Party here in Los Angeles. There's a really long, dark history with that, and I recommend that everyone read up about COINTELPRO. Are these deputy gangs like COINTELPRO? In my research, I haven't seen deputy gangs participating in the same sort of spying tactics that we saw from COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO did things like, there's a great example. They sent letters to Dr. Martin Luther King's friends and associates saying that he was going to kill himself. They sent him letters encouraging him to kill himself. They sent letters to his wife about him having extramarital affairs, that sort of thing, in Los Angeles. What that looked like was sending people to infiltrate these different groups and stir up animosity between the 2 of them, which, as I mentioned, escalated in a gun battle at the UCLA campus where several people were killed. I haven't seen anything that aggressive in that deputy gang members, sending them letters to people and sort of stirring up, animosities between different groups that may be brothers in arms in other circumstances. I haven't seen that. I am familiar with deputy gangs monitoring people. I myself have been assigned a team of so-called criminal analysts that are tasked with monitoring everything I post on social media. Several family members that have been sources of mine on my reporting have reported being followed by patrol cars. Some sources inside the department have reported county cars being stationed outside of their homes at all hours of the day and night. So maybe some of the more lighter touch when it comes to espionage type activities. But nothing to my knowledge quite as deep and intricate as what COINTELPRO was doing in the 1960s.
And that leads to one of the questions too. So maybe city officials and different people are maybe attached subtly to these gangs. Are dispatchers involved in the gangs?
I have heard of people from in every level of the sheriff's department being involved with deputy gangs, entry level, which is the deputies, all the way up to The undersheriff, we've had 2 undersheriffs that have been tattooed members of deputy gangs. So it's really everyone, and it also extends outside of the sheriff's department. I know that there was a deputy district attorney who said that he would be proud to be a Viking in a court proceeding. There has been deputy gang graffiti found outside of the door of sitting judges at the Los Angeles Superior Court. So it is not limited to the sheriff's department. Unfortunately, deputy gangs, the tendrils, reach into all parts of the law enforcement community.
What about women and African Americans? Because they seem to be not recruited as heavily as Latino and white members of the sheriff's department.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right. Most of these gangs, and I would say all of them, definitely espouse white supremacist ideology. So you do have a lot of white members. There are some gangs that are explicitly Latino, such as the Banditos at the East Los Angeles station. But you do see, people of color joining these gangs as well. Paul Tanaka, he's a Japanese American man. He was a member of the Vikings, which was explicitly described as a neo-Nazi white supremacist gang. There's a gang that I reported on functioning in the North County Correctional Facility, which is based on Ku Klux Klan ideology. And I know that there are several Latino members and at least one Black member. Women, there's one deputy gang that I'm studying now that I'm familiar with a couple of women that are members. And there's one deputy gang that I know of that is explicitly Black, and only has Black members. So yes, while they are, espousing this white supremacist ideology and tend to discriminate against some groups, there's always an exception, right? And you do not have to be a white supremacist you do not need to be a white person to participate in white supremacist ideology and uphold those ideals.
And then I have another question. I know in the fire department, I spent 35 years at the fire service, and I know the firemen would move to a area and they'd all live in this area, and pretty much so Cop City, does that exist?
Most definitely, yes. The Antelope Valley, and Santa Clarita are areas that have high numbers of law enforcement, sheriff's personnel living there. When you look at the Antelope Valley, you even see a program called resident deputies, where people that have lived in the area for a number of years are selected to police isolated areas of the Antelope Valley. And that unfortunately begets a lot of this further deputy gang behavior. One of my sources is not from the Antelope Valley, and he is a Latino man, and he was asked to work in the Antelope Valley. And he told me from the first day that he worked there that he was treated as an other. He was looked down upon and questioned. Why would you want to come work here? You're not one of us. You don't belong here. And he was continually ostracized and eventually ran out of the station.
Robie, you have a question?
You're mute, Robie.
Well, thank you, sir. Cerise, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. I really admire your courage and appreciate all the reporting you've done. I was wondering, for the students in the audience who might not know, could you share about Ruben Salazar? Because I understand that right before he was reportedly killed by the tear gas canister, that he was being followed, or he thought he was being followed. Yeah,
Ruben Salazar, fantastic journalist, and I encourage everyone to read on his reporting. He was one of the first Chicano reporters at the Los Angeles Times, and he made it his mission to cover Chicano issues. And this was during the 1970s when that really wasn't happening anywhere. And he was, one of the first people to do that. And as you mentioned, Robie, yes, Ruben Salazar was not afraid to question police narrative. And he did a number of stories before his untimely death that heavily investigated the police. And as a result of that, he reported to friends and colleagues that he was getting phone calls at night threatening his life, that he was being followed. He was present at the Chicano moratorium, which was one of the biggest protests at that point in East Los Angeles. It was organized by the Brown Berets to call attention to the high number of deaths of Chicano men that were participating in the Vietnam War. Chicanos were the group that had the highest number of casualties in the Vietnam War, and many of them were young men that were living in the East Los Angeles area. This protest was about 25,000 people, and it was a peaceful protest. It was a march through the streets of East Los Angeles to a park in East LA, which has since been renamed for Ruben Salazar. And he was there that day reporting on the protest. And the sheriff's department, the logo that I spoke about is actually based on what happened that day. Deputies were instructed by then Sheriff Sherman Block to keep a low profile, Sheriff Pitchess, to keep a low profile, which is written sort of tongue-in-cheek on that logo. What they did instead was descend on the park and begin beating people indiscriminately and shooting into the crowd. A number of people were killed that day, including Ruben Salazar. He saw what was happening in the streets and tried to get away. He took shelter in a bar with his colleague. They ordered some beers and were sitting in this bar, which is still standing today in East Los Angeles. And a man who has not been publicly identified, for whatever reason, approached a group of deputies and told them that two men, which were Ruben and his colleague, went into the bar with guns. That was a complete lie. In response, the sheriff's department surrounded the bar and fired a tear gas canister, which is explicitly labeled that it is not supposed to be used in this manner, into the bar. That canister struck Ruben Salazar in the head and killed him instantly. That death resulted in a LA County coroner inquest, which is a legal proceeding that looks a lot like a trial, but it isn't quite a trial. There are only 4 outcomes that can happen, and it's to decide in the manner of death, homicide, accidental, natural, so on. And the conclusion of this trial, there was really no conclusion. It left a lot of questions for people. Even though there was all this testimony, they weren't able to decide whether or not this was a homicide. The county did eventually settle with Ruben Salazar's family, which was one of the largest settlements at that time. But yes, his death is, something that I find very troubling, to say the least.
Thank you.
Wow.
Stan,
Go ahead.
do you mind if I ask a quick question from one of our professors on campus, Professor Mutaseb?
I was going to redo it. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So Professor Mutaseb asked, I have a question about the terminology. So I understand why you want to label those cliques gangs, as a term has been socially constructed by U.S. mainstream institutions as violent, ugly, terrible, etc. However, some scholars like Dwight Conquergood challenged such labeling, and through critical ethnographic work shed light on certain aspects of gang life away from the stereotype, focusing on the Chicano gangs. How do you view this issue of labels?
Yeah, I'm very confident labeling these deputy gangs as deputy gangs. These are explicitly criminal organizations. When we're talking about organizations that we see on the street that people, more commonly associate with gangs, I'm here in Los Angeles County, so I'm thinking about groups like the Hoovers, the Bloods, the Crips. I definitely would, tend to agree that these are more social organizations. And I would, use some of the sheriff's department language to describe those groups. I would see those more as, fraternities and social clubs. as opposed to explicitly criminal organizations. So when it comes to what is happening on the street, yes, I think we should be examining the words that we are using and be thoughtful and careful about how we are talking about people that may be, affiliated with a neighborhood group like the Crips, just based on, where they are born and who they are friends with and those associations. But when we're talking about what's happening inside the sheriff's department, make no mistake, yes, these are criminal gangs.
One of the things I saw on TV a while back is in the jails, they were taking Black gang members and Latino gang members and putting them in a courtyard and having them fight each other. And they were actually tracking who the toughest was and who the tough, and and that's the first time I ever thought there may be gangs in the sheriff's department, because it had to be organized. Do you remember that time?
I do, yes, the gladiator fights. And I've heard of similar things happening throughout different facilities, not just in the sheriff's department's control. And that, unfortunately, has a history dating back to the 1960s. I spoke to a former sheriff's department official who joined the department in the 1960s, and he told me that on his not his first shift, because they had to get to know him a little bit, but after he worked a couple of shifts, he was actually invited to come and witness the beating of an incarcerated man. And he was disgusted by this. And he said that he thought that he was going to quit the department. But he got a phone call the next day that everyone that had participated in that beating had been fired. Unfortunately, that did not root out the practice as it continues, but there is a strong history going back there for generations.
And I would even offer that it goes all the way back to slavery. I read a lot of books on the enslavement of Africans in this country, and one of the ways that the slave masters, who didn't do anything, so they had to find entertainment, and they would put African American, their enslaved folks together to fight to the death. This is my last question before we let you go. But a few years ago, we were getting a lot of gang activity in the Echo Park area, and these folks were coming from Central America. The Salvadoran gangs, the Guatemalan gangs. And so the county passed a gang injunction. And one of the provisos of the injunction was that if 2 or more of these gang members are together, they can be arrested. It's against the law, in other words. So that tells me that we can make a law for anything we want, right? I'm wondering if something like that could be applied to breaking up these gangs. I mean, I know they work together, and it's not an exact it's not an exact analogy, but nevertheless, what do you think about something like that?
Yes, and I'm familiar with a couple of law firms that are interested in pursuing litigation related to that around nuisance laws. The thinking is that we can look at the sheriff's department as a public nuisance, that these deputy gangs have, been responsible for a number of deaths, countless beatings, and false arrests of community members. And I, hope and expect that in the coming months, years, that we may see civil litigation filed pursuing that.
Great.
And my last question before we go too is, the military has been found that they actually were literally recruiting gangs or white supremacists so they could increase their numbers in the military. And so someone writes here that Bandidos are a global motorcycle club. Do you think there's recruiting going on to build these gangs up in the cities?
I'm not sure. To my knowledge, I haven't been familiar with deputy gangs recruiting people that may be active members in, so-called street gangs, the social organizations we were talking about a little bit earlier. But I am familiar with deputy gangs sort of working in concert with these groups outside the department to carry out criminal activity, money laundering, murders, that sort of thing.
We have had more questions today than we have in the past, and
Yeah,
so
more than anyone else.
we're gonna have to ask you to come back, because I have a whole bunch of questions myself, and we thank you for being here. This was a fantastic show, and I enjoyed it thoroughly.
And you've been so kind to stay all this time, Cerise. We appreciate your input and wish you all the best. Be careful, be safe. And just on a personal note, if you can email me your phone number, I'd like to talk to you about a possibility of something. So
yes,
love to hear from you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.